So in this last segment for this first part of the course, I'm just going to say a little bit about what we can do about all these problems. The key points I want to reiterate is that p-values can't be understood except unless you know the context in which they're computed. So people tend to use this 0.05 cutoff, but it only makes sense in relation to if you have an a priori hypothesis. So I try to illustrate with that example with correlations that you can get all sorts of correlations popping up as significant in completely random data. If you had an a priori view as to which two variables were going to be correlated together, then it's quite safe if you've got a clear hypothesis to interpret those p-values just as people typically do, to say, yes, there is only a 1 in 20 chance of a false positive. But if you're combing through a whole load of possibilities, there's real problems. And people often then make up a hypothesis post hoc to try and explain something they've observed, which is known as hypothesizing after results are known, or harking. And that is really dangerous because it means that you give the impression that you had a hypothesis and that your statistics are valid, when in fact you've used the data to derive the hypothesis and then tried to use the same data to test it, which is the big no-no. So you need to avoid this focus on just significant associations unless you've done some sort of correction for the multiple comparisons that you've got. And most people do this, but don't realize that it's really very misleading. This isn't to say you can't look for patterns in complex data. I mean, exploration of data is a key part of doing science. The problem is when you confuse exploration and hypothesis testing, or obscure the difference between them and use statistics, particularly p-values, in ways that are just not appropriate because you haven't taken into account the play of chance. So you can derive a hypothesis based on looking at your data, but then you really need a separate sample or a separate experiment to evaluate it. And if you look, again, you think about those correlational data, I could say, well, in any one run, it was quite common to find one or two correlations that had a p less than 0.05, but they weren't the same from one run to the next. So if you're getting something that's just coming up by chance, it's not going to replicate. So replication is quite a key issue here. I've shown you some ways in which you can get false positives, but there's a lot of others. This so-called hidden multiplicity of testing giving false results. Often people are almost unaware that they're doing it. There's data dredging from a large set of variables, which we've explored. But there's also, if you use multi-way ANOVA, where you're looking at a lot of main effects and interactions, or some people use regression approaches this way, multi-level modeling, anything where you're looking at a lot of main effects and interactions between them, you should be correcting for the number of main effects and interactions that you're considering if you're just exploring them and you haven't got a priori hypotheses that you're testing. There's a nice piece by Angelique Kramer about this. And then there's also just trying different analytic approaches until one sort of works, or dividing up your data into subgroups post hoc. All of these things will increase the likelihood of false positives. And quite often you're not even aware of just how many paths through the forking path you're taking, because you're not even aware that you're making all these small decisions, tweaking your data this way and that. This is just an illustration that brought home to me the dangers of this. I was completely unaware, despite having researched in this area for many years. In the field of ERP, or event-related potentials, where you're measuring from all these sensors embedded in a cap, minute electrical activity while people do particular tasks. And there's lots of ways you can analyze this. You can look at particular electrodes, particular time intervals, particular frequency bands in the response. You can vary how you measure a peak that you're interested in, and so on. And in this field, it's not uncommon to find people using many-way analysis of variance, where they take different groups, different sides of the head, different sites on the head, different conditions, different time intervals, and then put them into an analysis of variance and get terribly excited at a three-way interaction that pops up, not realizing that there is no correction in analysis of variance for all the things you're looking at. what analysis of variance does correct for is if you have a single factor like a group, and you've got two groups or three groups or four groups, it automatically corrects for the number of groups at that level, but it doesn't correct for number of interactions between factors and the number of factors that you're considering. Here's some, this was an early simulation that I actually did in, I think I did it in Excel, probably in the days before I knew how to do R, where I just ran, each of these is a run of a simulation, and the data were just random numbers, which I interpreted as reflecting effects of group, task, side, etc., put into an analysis of variance. And then the ones in highlighter runs where something popped up as significant. And it's very similar to what we did with the correlations. You see that on most runs, something pops up, but it's varying from one run to the next. And this is because in this case, we've got 15 different possible things that you could look at. You've got 4 main factors, and then you've got another 6 two-way interactions, and then you've got 3-way interactions, and I think the last one is a 4-way interaction, so yeah, that you see there. So you can see that it's very easy to get something if you look at enough things. And if you're doing it in an undisciplined exploratory way, you shouldn't really be interpreting these in terms of the p-values meaning anything particular unless you've corrected. So what are the solutions? Well, the first one, and the reason I'm running this course, is I think if you do data simulation, you suddenly, a lot of these things become clear in a way that they're not if somebody just tells you, oh, you shouldn't do this, or oh, that's problematic, or oh, that's biased. You can simulate, you're like God, you're creating your own data, and you will know if there's something in that data set or not, because that's how you created it. So you should be very worried if you're doing an analysis that you plan to do on real data, and you've simulated the data to have no effect, and yet you're getting lots of nice looking positive results coming out. There's clearly something wrong. And so this is what I recommend anybody does before running your own studies. Think about what the data is likely to look like, simulate some data that look like that, run them through the analysis that you plan to do. And this will really bring home to you the possibility of getting false positives. The other thing that I've been emphasizing is the importance of distinguishing exploration from hypothesis testing, which is a distinction that's very often blurred. And one way to make it less blurred is to say, well, this isn't possible for everyone, but if you're looking at a big data set, just use half of it to do your exploration if you feel you want to explore, and then say, can you replicate the same effects in another data set? If you can, then it suggests you're really onto something. But very often things won't replicate because they are simply down to the play of chance. This is now standard practice because in genetics, the early genetic studies that were done around 2000, there were tons and tons of spurious results coming out because people were looking at so many genetic variants and so many phenotypes. They were coming up with all sorts of false positives. And then they realized that for it to be publishable now, you typically have to replicate one of those results because people are not going to believe something that comes out of a single sample. The other thing that I'm very keen on is using something known as the registered report format when you're publishing, which forces you to think through in advance exactly what hypothesis you're testing and to specify why you're testing it, what hypothesis it is, and how you'll analyze your data. This is the brainchild of Chris Chambers, who's implemented this now in journals that he edits, but also got other journals to take it up. And it's got a very basic difference from standard publishing. So this is classic publishing where you do your study, you then submit it to a journal, you respond to reviewers who may or may not accept it, you may go round and round, dealing with reviewer comments, eventually get accepted and hopefully publish your paper. With registered reports, you submit your protocol, basically, your plan, which has to be pretty detailed. It has to have specific hypotheses that you're testing and an analysis plan. And they really like it if that includes some simulated data run through an analysis. And the reviewers then evaluate that. So you haven't yet collected any data at all. It's very clear then that these are your hypotheses, these are what you're going to do. But if it seems like a good analysis and a sensible question that you're asking, a well-designed study, you can have it accepted at that point. And then provided you do what you said you were going to do, it'll be publishable regardless of whether the results are positive or not. Because this is really making it very clear that you are testing a hypothesis which is pre-specified, and you can't sort of change your hypothesis midway through the study. Doesn't stop you doing exploratory analysis, but it makes it very clear what was a hypothesis in advance and what was exploration. I love this format. I've been using it increasingly in my own work, and I think it's actually gives you much stronger science if you can do this. And not everybody can, but if it's possible, it's great to do it. I just want to then finish by saying, pointing you to some further resources. I've shown you my very simple programs. I'm assuming many of you are complete beginners in R, and that even what I've shown you is probably quite challenging if you're not used to it. But if there are people on the course who are really already very skilled in R, you might be interested in following up some of these additional resources which take things to a much higher level. These are just some of my further simulations, but they're all available. And then indeed, there's extra ones now on Open Science Framework. As I teach this stuff, I try to make more and more little programs just to illustrate these points. So you're welcome to download and play with those. Mixed effects models in psychology in particular have become very popular. And Lisa De Bruin and Dale Barr have made some simulation packages specifically to be compatible with that sort of design and allow you to quite easily simulate data in that sort of situation. Keith Goldfeld has devised something called SimStudy, which is a R package principally designed to just simulate all sorts of different types of data. I've found it actually quite difficult to work my way through what he's doing. I think it's very clever, but it's not terribly clearly explained. I know, but I did work through a little example. So, and I tried to sort of do a forking paths demonstration using SimStudy. So you might like to look at that if that's something you're tempted by. He certainly allows you to simulate very different sorts of data, not just normally distributed data, but all sorts of different formats. And then this is, again, is something I'm very keen on, but I find quite difficult, quite challenging to work through. These are some guys from social sciences who have got a whole package that doesn't just simulate data, but also does power analysis and sort of allows you to evaluate what is an optimal design in a particular situation. And they have a fully integrated sort of model of what a research design is and how it maps onto data. I think it's excellent stuff. It is challenging, but if you're somebody who likes a challenge, you might enjoy looking at what they're doing. That's all online and it's evolving. They're doing a book at the moment about how to use this, which I think will be making a big contribution in its time. But that's it for now. What I would like to suggest is that if you would like to attend a more interactive session, I will be doing those with a couple of my postdocs, depending on how many people say they want to come along. And it would be really useful to know before we run those sessions, what sort of questions people have, what sort of topics they might like to cover, whether they would want specific assistance with particular things. I can't guarantee to be able to do everything, but would be very happy to interact with people on that. So please do send through in advance your ideas about what you want to do, ideally a week before we have that online session. And I look forward to meeting some of you then, but thanks very much.